The sky hung low and colorless above the flat, heat-scoured plain as though the sun itself had been scraped raw. Dust whispered across the porch like dry breath, curling at the corners of the warped floorboards. Clara stood barefoot on the edge, the grain of the wood familiar to her soles, arms wrapped around herself despite the warm air. She watched a lone coyote slip along the ridgeline, its coat scraggly, its gait quiet with intent. Nothing chased it. It moved like a ghost, and Clara felt a strange kind of kinship with it, both of them thin with silence, full of unspent motion. Behind her, the screen door banged lightly in the wind. She didn't turn. She could hear her father muttering scripture inside, the worn cadence of his voice skipping like a record gone too long. He recited from memory now, the words no longer directed at God but at the walls, the chairs, and Clara's obedience. The man didn't raise his voice often, but when he did, it was not in anger, it was in certainty. That, somehow, was worse. The sky shifted. Far off, a column of dust rose where the road bent around a low cluster of bluffs. Clara narrowed her eyes, the sun catching gold in her lashes. The rider came slow, steady, the gait of the horse patient and unhurried. She didn't stir until she heard her father step out behind her. The boards creaked under his weight. He smelled of sweat and old firewood, tobacco buried in his shirt collar. He said nothing to her. He just walked past and waited at the edge of the yard. The rider dismounted with the stiffness of someone who had traveled far without stopping. He was tall, broad-shouldered, not young but not yet weathered. He brushed dust from his coat, then took off his hat and held it in his hands. His hair was dark with streaks of sun-bleached brown. His face held no expression, but his eyes searched the yard like he'd known it once in a dream. "You Reese Calloway?" her father asked. The man nodded. "I am." "Figured. You don't ride like no cowhand." "I'm not." They stood there, men of few words, sizing each other up with the weight of unspoken things. Clara stayed still on the porch, arms crossed now, fingers gripping her elbows. The breeze had picked up, carrying the scent of sage and sun-baked weeds. Reese spoke again. "You said you were looking for money?" Her father's laugh was small, mirthless. "Ain't everyone? You got something I need." There was a pause. Then the old man's voice, "You mean the girl?" Clara flinched, though only inwardly. The word, the girl, landed in her gut like a cold stone. She wasn't often spoken of directly. Not to others. Her presence was always implied, like furniture, like background. "I'm looking for a wife," Reese said plainly. Her father tilted his head. "You're not here to court her?" "No." "You want her sight unseen?" "I saw her once. In town. 3 months back. She was buying feed." Clara remembered the day. A stranger had passed her without saying a word but had held her gaze an extra second. Not rudely, not hungrily. Just held it. She hadn't told her father. "She don't talk much," the old man said. "I don't need her to." Silence. "You got money?" "Enough." Her father scratched the back of his neck, spit into the dirt. "She's strong. Quiet. Does as she's told. I'm not looking for soft." Inside her chest, something flickered, something between insult and relief. They walked to the porch. Clara didn't move. Her eyes met Reese's for the first time in the full light. He looked at her not like a man buying something but like someone measuring weight, distance, weather. Her father gestured toward her like a product on display. "She can cook, mend, keep a house. I raised her proper. You don't have to worry about willfulness." Clara's stomach turned. Reese didn't answer immediately. He reached into his coat, pulled out an envelope. Her father took it, opened it, counted. His fingers trembled slightly, though his face stayed blank. Then he nodded, folded the envelope again, and slipped it into his back pocket like it was no more than a recipe. "You can take her." The words hit Clara harder than the last time he'd whipped her. There was no ceremony. No blessing. No warning. Reese stepped forward and offered his hand, not to shake hers, but to carry her bag. She hadn't packed one. Her father grunted and went inside. She stood there a moment longer, then turned without expression and walked through the door. She gathered her clothes, a comb, her worn Bible, and the small wooden box her mother had left behind before vanishing years ago. No one spoke of her mother anymore. When Clara stepped off the porch with the burlap sack in hand, the air felt different. Lighter somehow. Though she could hear her father's voice behind the walls, quoting the same lines about women and obedience, she did not look back. She handed the bag to Reese. He took it without comment, slung it over his horse's flank, and offered her a stirrup. She hesitated just long enough to feel her knees go soft, then swung up behind him. Her hands rested at her sides. He didn't tell her where to put them. She decided, slowly, to hold the back of his coat, just enough to feel connected. They rode past the old fence posts, sun-bleached and leaning, the horizon swallowing the road ahead. When they reached the town edge, people had already begun to whisper. A child pointed. A woman whispered into another's hair. The blacksmith, elbows deep in soot, glanced up with something like pity. She's that preacher's girl. Thought she'd be married to God, not sold like grain. Clara's back remained straight. Her chin too. She didn't meet any eyes, not even the ones that tried to soften when they saw her raw palms and stiff jaw. Rhys said nothing, but his pace remained calm. He didn't try to rush her through. He didn't apologize for what the town thought. And she found that more comforting than kindness might have been. By the time they reached the edge of the valley, the sun had begun to tip toward evening. The wind changed direction. Somewhere far behind them, the land they left still baked beneath a hard sky. Clara looked sideways at the road ahead. It was unfamiliar. Long quiet. She didn't know his voice yet. Didn't know his hands or his habits. But there was something about the rhythm of his breath, the sure way he held the reins, that made her believe, tentatively, that she might not need to flinch here. Not right away. They stopped at a stream to let the horse drink. She climbed down without asking. Her legs were numb from the ride. She crouched beside the water, touched it, not to wash but to feel something colder than herself. Behind her, Rhys stood still, watching the horizon. He didn't speak, didn't offer food or conversation. Instead, he unhooked a canteen and placed it on a rock near her elbow, then returned to the horse. When she looked back at him, he wasn't looking at her. He was adjusting the stirrups, methodical, hands sure. She thought of how her father's hands moved, always fast, punishing, never careful. They mounted again. The sun dipped lower. Shadows stretched like old bones across the prairie. By the time they reached his land, flat and wide and circled by rusted barbed wire, Clara's eyes had stopped scanning for landmarks. She wasn't lost. She just wasn't home. Not yet. Rhys dismounted, tied the horse, and led her toward the cabin. He pushed open the door, stepped aside so she could go first. The room smelled like pine, fire ash, and dust. It was quiet. "There's a bed through there," he said finally. "Water pumps out back. Wood stove works. I'll sleep in the barn tonight. If you need anything, knock once on the wall." She didn't answer, but her throat was tight. He placed her bag by the bed and walked out without waiting. Clara stood in the doorway, staring at the floor. There was a rug. Worn but clean. A lantern glowed faintly. A chair beside the window looked like it had been used, not for praying or punishing, but for sitting. Just sitting. She stepped inside, shut the door behind her, and leaned her forehead against it. Outside, the wind carried dust down into the valley like falling silk. A barn door groaned once, then settled. For the first time in years, the silence around Clara didn't feel like a prison. It felt like space. Like air. And she breathed. The mornings began in silence, but it was not the silence she'd known before. At her father's house, silence was the tightness before a slap or the echo after a shouted verse. Here, it spread slowly like sunlight over frost, the kind of quiet that allowed a person to exhale without flinching. Clara woke early, always before Rhys, though he rarely slept in. She moved through the small cabin barefoot, her steps light, deliberate. She swept the dust from corners he hadn't touched. She boiled water even if she didn't plan to drink it. Order gave her spine. He left a mug of coffee on the windowsill every morning. No note, no gesture. Just the mug, the steam rising faintly. Some mornings she ignored it. Other mornings she took it, poured it into her own enamel cup, and drank it slowly as she watched the field beyond the house change in light. It was late spring, and the prairie was waking up in patches, wild grass pushing between dry clods, soft green rising out of beige. Clara found herself noticing these things now, how quiet growth could be. How patient. Rhys spoke rarely. When he did, it was brief and direct, his voice steady but unassuming. He spent most days tending to the cattle or repairing the fence line that bordered the far west pasture. He took his meals without commentary, though he'd begun setting out 2 plates instead of 1. Clara had expected him to demand something, touch, service, obedience, but he hadn't. Not once. The night he'd brought her home, he'd disappeared into the barn, and every night since he'd returned there to sleep, leaving her the bed without question. The first time she touched a quilt in the dark and didn't flinch from sound, her throat clenched in confusion. It felt too good, too easy. It couldn't be real. One afternoon, she watched him from the edge of the porch as he approached the house, his shirt dark with sweat, the sun painting his skin the color of baked earth. His stride was calm, unfussy. He stopped at the trough, splashed water over his neck and arms, then looked up and met her eyes. He didn't smile, didn't wave. Just nodded once. She didn't nod back. But her chest warmed quietly like a stove lit low. The connection between them grew in increments, gestures instead of words, glances instead of conversation. She began to fold his shirts, not out of duty, but because the lines of creased fabric felt like something clean. He left a carved piece of wood on the table one evening, a horse in mid-step, unfinished but shaped with care. She ran her fingers over it, then returned it to the exact spot he'd left it. On the 6th morning, she found a radio on the windowsill beside the coffee. It was old, dented, but whole. She stared at it for several minutes, then carried it inside and set it on the dresser. He hadn't said anything about it. She didn't ask. Days passed, each one shaped by rhythm more than variation. She fixed a gate hinge without asking. He repaired the stove when it stuck. They lived beside each other rather than with each other, but something tethered them. Not desire, at least not in the raw, reckless way she'd heard whispered about in town, but recognition. Of solitude. Of weariness. Of survival without complaint. They rode to town once every 2 weeks. Rhys brought Liz. Clara brought silence. She didn't speak unless asked, and even then her voice barely reached her own ears. But she noticed how the townsfolk watched her, how the whispers traveled in her wake like dust caught in a swirl of wind. "That's her," someone hissed near the general store. "Preacher's girl. Traded for coin." Clara didn't stop walking, but her jaw tightened. At the feed store, the clerk pretended not to hear her when she asked for oats. Rhys stepped forward, repeated the order, and the clerk complied. No comments, no confrontation. Just a quiet dismissal she'd known too well. Back at the wagon, Rhys passed her a small wrapped bundle, a stick of licorice twisted and dark. She stared at it for a long moment before unwrapping it and placing it on her tongue. It was the first sweet thing she'd tasted in years. That night, Clara stood outside while the stars came in. Rhys was brushing down the mare, his hands slow and practiced. She watched the way he moved around the animal, not dominating, just being near. She stepped closer. "She was my mother's," she said softly, nodding toward the mare. Rhys glanced up but didn't speak. He just kept brushing. "She left when I was 8. Didn't say goodbye." He didn't interrupt. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was spacious, like something had made room for her words and wasn't rushing to fill the void. When she turned to go back inside, he said, "I can fix the radio tomorrow." She paused, her hand on the doorframe. "Thank you." It was the first real thank you she'd given him. Not out of obligation but out of something else. Something forming in the space between absence and presence. The next day he was gone early. She found the radio open on the kitchen table, its guts laid bare, wires coiled like veins. He worked through the morning, sweat beading on his brow, mouth set in concentration. She watched from the stove as he reassembled it piece by piece. When he twisted the dial and a soft, crackling waltz spilled into the room, she nearly dropped the plate in her hands. Rhys didn't look up, didn't react. He just stood and went to the pump, washing his hands as if he'd fixed nothing more than a fence. Clara turned the dial until she found a station playing something slow and mournful. She sat beside the window, listening, her spine still straight but no longer rigid. Music. She hadn't heard it in so long it felt like a sound invented just for her. The following morning, the porch felt warmer than usual. She stepped out into the early haze and watched Rhys gathering kindling near the shed. A breeze lifted her hair and she let it. No one told her to braid it. No one called her name with anger. She thought about what it meant to be chosen, not because she was beautiful or meek or useful, but because someone saw her standing in the middle of a feed store, and somehow decided she belonged in a house with a working stove and a broken radio. The days blurred but not in monotony. In rhythm. She knew his cough from the dust. He knew the way she hummed when she scrubbed the porch. She made stew without being asked. He began stacking firewood where she could reach it. Once, when the wind came up hard from the north and the sky darkened too fast for comfort, they both moved in tandem, pulling laundry off the line, closing windows, latching the barn doors. When the first drops hit the roof, they stood inside the cabin, breath quick from the run, shoulders damp, eyes wide. "It'll pass quick," Rhys said. But she didn't want it to. Not right away. That night, the storm rolled past like a beast low to the ground, thunder distant and slow. They didn't speak much. She read a passage from her mother's old Bible, not aloud, just mouthing the words. He whittled another figure beside the fire. It looked like a bird, wings tucked in. Before bed, he placed it on the mantel. This one he hadn't offered to her. He simply left it there as if the house itself deserved a gift. Later, she lay awake, listening to the barn door knock faintly in the wind. She could picture him out there, sprawled on the cot, blanket half pulled, eyes open in the dark like hers. In the morning, she found another carved piece beside the coffee mug. A woman kneeling, hands open, hair carved long and rough. Clara held it in her palm for a long time, tracing the edges, the careful curves. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. But she stood a little straighter that day. And when she swept the porch, she let herself hum the waltz from the radio. That night, Rhys lingered longer before heading to the barn. He stood at the doorway watching her fold the quilt. "I've been thinking about putting a windmill up near the well," he said. She looked at him, eyebrows lifted. "You need help?" He shook his head. "Just thought you'd want to pick the spot." She set the quilt down. "All right." They didn't say goodnight. They didn't need to. As he walked back across the field, a lone coyote stood far off at the edge of the pasture. It watched him with still eyes before disappearing into the brush. The sky above held stars that night, bright, sharp, endless. And Clara, sitting at the windowsill, watched the dark knowing something had shifted. Not completely. Not loudly. But enough to let her believe this story might still be hers to write. The heat came early that summer, rolling across the land in thick waves that made the horizon shimmer. Dust rose from the road with every passing wagon, hanging in the air like a question that refused to settle. Clara stood beside the porch with a pail in her hands, her fingers damp and red from scrubbing. Her hair had come loose in the wind. She didn't bother tucking it back. She watched the valley and the sky with a stillness that wasn't resignation, it was readiness. Something had changed in the last week. Rhys had sensed it too. He was quieter even for him. The cows had begun to pace at night, uneasy without visible reason. Birds flew lower, dipping close to the ground as though trying to hide from something overhead. And the town, when they'd last gone to the general store, had felt different. Stiff. Watching. At the pump, Rhys filled the trough and didn't look up when he said, "Saw a man at the saloon yesterday. Said your father's back in town." Clara didn't speak. She set the pail down with care and straightened her back. Her chest tightened like a knot being pulled. "Said he's been talking loud. Said he's been drinking." Still she didn't speak. But something in her eyes pulled inward and she nodded once. "He told people he was cheated," Rhys added. "That he wants you back." This time she met his gaze. "I'm not property," she said. Her voice didn't tremble. "I know. I won't go." "I know," he said again. She turned, walked into the house and sat by the window, staring at the carved figures on the mantel. The bird. The horse. The kneeling woman. They stared back like witnesses, shaped by hands that had never hurt her. That evening, she found the small rifle they kept beside the door and oiled it. Not out of fear but precision. 2 days later, her father arrived. The wagon rolled into the yard with a rattle of chain and wood. His boots hit the dirt before the horse had stopped moving. Clara stepped out onto the porch without waiting for him to speak. Her body didn't shake. Her arms were at her sides. He was thicker now, rounder in the jaw and stomach, but his eyes burned the same, cold fire, old self-righteousness. He carried a Bible in one hand and a bottle in the other. He looked at Rhys, then at her, then back again. "You owe me," he said. Rhys didn't answer. He stood beside the trough, still as stone. "I gave her to you in good faith," the old man continued. "And I heard talk that you ain't touched her. That you treat her like some hired girl instead of a wife. What kind of man pays for a woman and don't take her?" Clara's breath caught in her chest, but she held steady. "You got the money," Rhys said evenly. "Not near enough. Not for her. Not for what I gave up. She wasn't yours to sell." Her father stepped closer, his boots sending up little clouds of grit. "You think you can take her from me? Like you're better than the word of God. She left with me. That's not theft." Clara stepped forward then, voice low and steady. "You didn't lose anything. You threw me away." He turned to her, lip curling. "You little whore. You walk around here with your head high like you earned something. You ain't earned a thing. You should be grateful I kept you all these years. Fed you. Taught you. You taught me how to disappear," she said. Her voice didn't rise, but it rang through the yard like a bell. "I lived in a house where no one saw me. Where pain was mistaken for righteousness." He took another step toward her. "You're coming with me." "I'm not." His hand twitched toward his belt, not for a weapon but for the gesture she'd seen too many times before. A warning. An invitation to flinch. Rhys's voice came quiet and flat. "Don't put your hands on her." The preacher turned. "You gonna stop me?" Rhys didn't move. His fingers weren't near the rifle. He just stood there, looking at the old man like he was nothing more than another fence to be mended or torn down. "She's not yours," Rhys said. "Not anymore." The silence that followed was thicker than heat, heavier than dust. A hawk circled overhead, casting a shifting shadow across the dirt. "I'll go to the sheriff," her father said. "I'll say you took her. Say you're keeping her prisoner." "You already said that," Clara answered. He looked at her then, and something in his eyes cracked. Not rage but desperation. Not power but its fading echo. He spat in the dirt and stepped back. "This ain't over," he said. Clara stepped down from the porch. Her boots landed firm in the soil. She walked up to him slowly, deliberately, until she stood only a breath away. "I decide when it's over," she said. And then, without another word, she turned and walked back inside. Rhys didn't follow. He stood there a long time watching the man retreat. The wagon wheels turned like a clock counting down the last of something rotten. That night, Rhys didn't go to the barn. He stood at the doorway of the house, uncertain for the first time. "You can come in," Clara said. He nodded and stepped inside. The fire was low but warm. She sat by the radio, fingers wrapped around a cup of water, her eyes thoughtful but not distant. "You all right?" he asked. "I'm tired," she said, "but not afraid." He sat across from her, the carved woman between them on the windowsill. Outside, the wind had stilled, the sky settling into dusk. "You didn't need to speak for me," she said after a moment. "I know. But thank you." He nodded. She reached for the radio, turned the dial until she found a song slow and aching. They sat in the quiet between the notes, the air soft with smoke and lavender oil. Rhys cleared his throat. "I meant to ask, do you want me to stay in the house now?" She thought for a long moment. "I want to wake up knowing you're not out there alone." He didn't smile. He just looked down, then stood. He didn't go to the barn. Later, she lay in the bed with the window open. The stars were out, pale and blinking, and the night smelled like something about to grow. In the other room, Rhys's breath was slow, steady. Not sleep, but something near it. She closed her eyes and thought of the mare in the barn, heavy with foal. Of the windmill they'd staked out near the well. Of the hawk circling overhead. Of the man who had left and would not return. Not truly. The morning came cool and gold. She rose early and stepped outside barefoot, the ground soft with dew. In the barn, she found Rhys already awake, kneeling beside the mare as she strained and shivered in the straw. He looked up at Clara as she approached, his eyes wide but calm. "She's ready," he said. Clara crouched beside him. They worked without words, their hands moving in sync, patience and breath holding the moment steady. And then, with a final heave, the foal slipped into the world, slick, fragile, blinking at the light. The mare nuzzled it gently, and Clara reached out to steady its trembling legs. Her palms, so often made to flinch, now held something alive. When they stepped out of the barn, the sun was climbing over the edge of the world, catching the tips of the field in fire. Rhys looked at her. "You did that." Clara looked back. "We did." They stood in silence, not needing to say more. "Not yet. Maybe not ever." She took his hand then, not as a gesture of romance or obligation, but of choosing. She didn't squeeze, just held. And together they stood, the prairie stretching wide before them, the road behind dissolving into dust and light.